I'm Davy Jones, and I am the chair of Brighton Yoga Foundation, and we have a project to explain and develop the interesting history of yoga in the city. We currently have probably the largest yoga population per head of anywhere in the UK, possibly even in Europe, I think. And the history of yoga in the city is very rich and exciting, and I think has helped in some ways to shape the city itself. So I'm going out of my way to interview a lot of people who are integral to the whole history of yoga in the city. And today I'm interviewing Peter Blackaby, who lives not that far away from me, and whose studio is just around the corner, and whose classes I've been to and I can recommend to others. So Pete, welcome to this interview. And I'd like to start by asking you, are you a Brighton born and bred, or did you come to the city? How did you end up here?
I was sort of Sussex born and bred. I've never, here's an extraordinary fact about myself, I've never lived more than 10 miles away from where I was born. So I was born in grew up in Stenning. I was born in Shoreham. And I moved to Brighton in 1995, I think. After, I lived around West Sussex, a few different places, with my then partner, and then we separated. She stayed in Stenning. I moved to Brighton, and I've loved it ever since. Actually, I'm very fond of Brighton.
Yeah, me too. Best place to live, I think, by a long way.
Well, one of the reasons why I haven't moved is because I can't think of anywhere else I'd rather move. I sometimes think about moving, and I think, well, where would I go? And I think about it, and I keep coming back to Brighton. So yeah. I'm still here.
The sea and the downs and all the yoga. What more can you want, really?
Exactly. Yeah, it's the truth.
So, how did you first get into yoga? Because that would have been well before 1995, I think. Sure. So, tell me how that all started. I believe you were first really into Iyengar yoga, but you tell me.
Well, there's a little bit of a preamble before that. You just told me you're a little bit older than me. Well, I think you did. No, were you a bit younger? I can't remember.
No, a bit older.
So, anyway, I kind of grew, like you, we were on the tail end, or I was certainly on the tail end of the 60s. And so I grew up in that kind of slightly hippie background to my life. And of course, the Maharishi Mahesh and the Bhagwan Rajneesh, all those kind of people were people you heard about, and was kind of mystery and mystical. And I had a friend at the time who did the whole India thing. He went and actually stayed with the Kampati yogis in the Himalayas for about a year. And he got deported in the end because he didn't want to leave India. And he came back and he lived in my house where I was staying. We used to live on a farm with a few other friends. And he would tell me all these stories about yoga. This is probably in my early 20s. And it was kind of fascinating. The stories he told, I think they were quite tall stories in retrospect. They're quite magical. He told me stories about people just vanishing in front of your eyes, and the power of telepathy they had, and all this kind of stuff. And of course, I was entranced a bit by it, and started reading around the subject and got interested in it. And it was the 70s, which was a bit grim in England, wasn't it, at the time? Margaret Thatcher, and the whole 3-day week had just gone by, and it was a bit like it is now. There was a lot of tension in the air. It was a lot of fragmentation in society. I didn't much like what I was seeing. So this kind of magical mystery tour that yoga seemed to represent to me was enticing to a young man. And not, I didn't have anywhere near the kind of courage that my friend did. So I didn't go to India. I went to Stenning Community Centre to learn yoga.
Less far to travel.
Yeah, it was a bit less far to travel. It was about 500 yards from my house rather than 5,000 miles. So and I bought a few books on yoga and read around the subject, and I ended up in a class with a rather maternal woman called Eileen White, who was a kind of Iyengar teacher. Actually, she was one of the, progenitors of Iyengar yoga in the area. She knew Raina Curtis and people like that. And like Raina had met Iyengar. But she was also fairly magical. She used to tell me stories about being able to, she had this kind of whole thing about hypnotism and being able to make people better by yoga, curing people of all kinds of strange illnesses. So the kind of mystery side of it continued. And I think I was very into the idea that I was learning something magical, something bigger than the rather grim world I was inhabiting. And that appealed to me. And of course, I never did find that in that kind of magical way. I found something else, which was just a practice, which was a lot more useful to me than magic.
And how long did that sort of phase of your yoga life continue? I mean, how long were you just sort of dabbling in, going to the odd class here and there? I mean, when did you start getting interested in it in a more serious sort of way?
Well, it's difficult to know where the kind of lines cross, because part of it is your own maturation process. I'm also slightly dyslexic and slightly dyspraxic. So all the way through school, I never fitted into academia because I couldn't spell, I couldn't write very well, and I couldn't kick a football. So you didn't. I wasn't easily placed at school. I was an outcast, as it were, and I think that's probably what shaped a little bit of my life. Yoga was a bit of an outcast thing to do, and I liked that role in the end. I grew into it a bit rather than when I was at primary school and early parts of my school life. It was foisted on me because I couldn't fit in because of my kind of semi-disabilities, if you like. But as I got older, I took the mantle of an outcast a bit more, and it felt, I could inhabit that a bit more reasonably. And that's probably why I studied osteopathy as well. It was an alternative kind of thing. It wasn't mainstream. But the weird thing is that in the whole process of studying and paying attention and learning how to do yoga and reading stuff, I became less and less magical in my thinking and more, I'm going to hesitate to use the word rational, but it's probably a word I would, reasonable. I think I prefer the word reasonable than rational. And that process has kind of carried on with lots of caveats we may get to. Yeah. But yeah, so I've turned from a magical yoga teacher to a reasonable yoga teacher. That's what I would call it. Yeah.
And had your interest in osteopathy started at the same sort of time, or did that come later? What was the order?
No. I was a carpenter. I used to restore furniture. So, but the first kind of, after I dabbled with a few jobs, the one I settled into was carpentry. And I used to have I started off with a little shop in Worthing, then a bigger shop. And then I moved I started employing people. And I had quite a big business at one time.
I'll bear that in mind. Next time I need some shelves.
No, don't don't I don't do it anymore. But it was, I enjoyed it. It was quite good fun. But I was practicing yoga all the time. But then around the kind of late 80s, the business was struggling. I mean, we had lots of recessions. We had inflation of sort of 25%, and the pound devalued, and I used to export a lot of the furniture I was selling. So I couldn't see a future in the business. And although I had just about qualified as a yoga teacher, I qualified in 86 as an Iyengar teacher. I knew I wasn't going to make my living out of yoga. In those days, it was still very much a side issue. And I was thinking, what else could I do while my business was slowly going down the pan? And I remember being around at my brother's house. He lived in Maidstone at the time. And there were 2 colleges of osteopathy in Maidstone. And he said, have you ever thought of doing osteopathy? And it was one of those very rare moments where a light bulb goes off in your head and think, that's really absolutely what I want to do. Because, I was interested in bodies by then. I was I've been using my body in yoga. I've been thinking a bit about it. People have been telling me stuff about it. And I thought, this is going to be brilliant. I can earn a living doing something slightly allied to what I'm enjoying in yoga. And and it was probably the best decision ever made. The training in osteopathy, not because I think it's a hugely brilliant system, but because it did a lot of things for me. It gave me confidence in myself. I realized I could think. I wasn't stupid like I've been told at school, and I did very well. I was very interested in it, and I'd like to think I was fairly natural at the process of osteopathy. It came to me fairly easily, so I really enjoyed that. But that led to a kind of interesting dichotomy in a way, because what I was learning in biomechanics and anatomy in osteopathy was bumping into some of the things I've been taught in as Iyengar yoga, and that was my first kind of doubt that Iyengar might be fallible.
Yeah.
Because up until then, he was just this man who was, you just agreed with everything he said. He was the oracle.
Just going back, just scrolling back a little bit.
Yeah.
How long roughly do you think you've been doing yoga before you actually thought, I want to become a yoga teacher, and did the teacher training and qualifications and all that?
6 years. I've been doing it 6 years. I started yoga when I was 24, and I qualified as a teacher when I was 30.
Mm.
So that was the period of time, and that was a fairly, in those days it was a little bit more like your teacher told you when you should train. I didn't aspire to be a yoga teacher. I didn't say to myself, "No, I'm going to train yoga." My teacher at the time, a guy called Jonathan Hindon, I don't know if you've come across him. He was the kind of senior Iyengar teacher in Brighton, apart from Rainer, in the early days. Very interesting man. He dropped out of medical schools in his final year, but knew a lot of anatomy and medicine. So he had that side. Very brilliant man. He stopped teaching yoga, I think, in the end, to go and lecture about opera and classical music. So he was well read. But he was a big figure in my early Iyengar life. And he said to me at some point, "You need to train to be a teacher." And there was about 4 or 5 of us at the time. There's Louise Beglin, you probably know, Kathy Rogers, Jenny Debman, and a couple of others. Right, name escaped me at the moment, but we all went through the training at about the same time, and around about 86, 87, 85, we all qualified. So,
did you ever meet Iyengar? Did you?
Yeah, 2 or 3. Or meet him. I mean, I didn't go out to dinner with him or anything, but yeah, well, on 2 or 3 occasions. I mean, notably when he taught the Brighthelm Centre. He came and did a lecture at the Brighthelm Centre, and I was one of his guinea pigs. And because he was asking questions, and I've been a headache sufferer most of my life. On and off, I get headaches and sometimes migraines. And I wanted to know. I used to get migraines every time I did shoulder stand. And in the end, it put me off doing them. And so one of my questions to him, we were allowed to write questions for him, and my question came up. What should I do to stop myself getting migraines in shoulder stand? And he put me up on stage and showed me what he thought I should do, which was do my shoulder stand on about 8 blocks. And rather unhelpfully, he told me as I was coming up the stairs, and he looked at me and he said, "Well, you were born with a headache. That's your problem." I thought, thanks, mate.
Yeah.
I know. But, so there was that. And then another time when he was teaching in Brighton, we had a picnic on Pavilion Gardens, and I with Rainer, and I was there for that one. I saw him 2 or 3 times in Oxford when he came to teach. I went over with people like Kathy and Louise, and I went to London to see him at the Barbican. And he was a very, as everyone says about him, he was a very big presence. But most of us were pretty scared of him, to be honest. You know, you didn't really want to be in his class because you weren't quite sure if you were going to survive his kind of steely gaze and heavy hand.
Yeah, I've seen a few videos of him using a stick to hit people with as well if
Mhm.
they weren't doing the posture correctly, which is an unusual way to do adjustments.
Well, I know, but it is. I mean, and you know, we're a bit more onto all this stuff now. But and you reflect on it, you do. There was a kind of feeling in those days of a bit like going in the army, really. You know, it's a kind of toughening up process. You
Yeah.
know, could you take it? And people would go to tougher and tougher workshops, and of course, he was the toughest. But there was a kind of macho element to anger in those days, and I remember there were a couple of Kofi Busai. You know, he's a Nigerian anger teacher who I think lived in Oxford. He was very um, powerful in his teaching, and used to go to his classes and come out feeling completely beaten up, and you know, smile as you went out with your comrades. Oh, that was tough, wasn't it? It was a great class. Everyone's hobbling out. It's a very different kind of vibe, and we just didn't know any better, I don't think.
Mm. So you were when the osteopathy started, you said it began to rub up against the Iyengar teaching and some of the things on
Hmm,
alignment and the
sure.
body and so on. I mean, could you just say a little bit more about that? Because I think that's a journey that a number of people have taken, and it's
Hmm.
interesting to see how it manifested for you.
Well, yeah, I'd have to say there's been a subsequent journey, but the that journey was, or that particular thing, were very simple things like you know, in standing warrior positions where one foot was, you know, like warrior one, you had a back foot turned out at 45 degrees, and then you were being asked to square your hips up to the front with your legs. And that puts a torsion through the knee, in
Mm,
the back knee, you know. And if you do that over and over again, knees don't really like being torqued. They're fundamentally hinge joints in their nature. So putting a twisting force through a knee on a regular basis is going to create problems. And then there was, you know, his version of Trikonasana, where you're kind of doing these deep side reaches, and how much stress, that torsional force and shearing force that puts on the lumbar sacral joint. And you know, I was learning about shearing forces in you know, that's what you don't want in joints. So everything in osteopathy was you don't put shearing forces through joints. And there we were doing it every day in a yoga class, and I was thinking, hang on, this, you know, and what was really kind of sobering, I suppose, and quite alienating was when I would bounce into my class with my comrades and say, hey, look, I found all this out about shearing forces, and we shouldn't do Trikonasana like this or Warrior One like this. We should modify this. It was like everyone was going, woo, sort of backing away. They didn't want to hear that Iyengar could be wrong.
mm.
And it was, yeah, and I have to say, for a couple of years, I felt quite alienated. You know, I was shunned a bit. I don't think in a
A heretic.
yeah. I mean, I was clearly not well. It was not welcome to be critical,
Mm.
and I had an uncomfortable couple of years trying to navigate that and felt a bit in the wilderness. I couldn't progress in my anger world anymore because there was too much I didn't agree with, and no one was accepting. Ruth White was fairly kind to me. I'd have to say that, and then of course I got slightly rescued by Mary Stewart, and who became who had been one of the first teachers to work with Vanda Scaravelli.
Mm.
So and she sort of showed me another way of working, you know, and then that was like a pivotal point, I suppose, in my yoga life.
How did you come across her? Was she another ex-Iyengar or not?
Yeah, Mary Stewart was a very senior Iyengar teacher.
Mm.
Um, and I think she'd been at the wrong end of his, you know, harsh tongue at some point. And although she had put up with it for quite a long time, I can't quite remember the story about how she met Vanda, who also, as we know, knew Iyengar and Deskachar and Krishnamurti. So she was quite an interesting woman. But Mary was immediately taken by the way Vanda had worked, which was a much less harsh way of working, much more respectful of the body. And I still thank my stars that I met her, because she steered me into a very different direction. I think probably if you sort of saw her working now, you would think she was still pretty tough. I think a lot of people thought she was quite tough, but compared to Iyengar and her just general approach, which wasn't, beat your body up, it was more respectful.
Well, whenabouts was this then? When would this have been roughly that you would have come
I
across
would have
in this?
thought, yeah, sort of 1989, 1990, something like that. Maybe 91, that kind of period. That was what I call my transition period.
Yeah.
So I've been teaching. Yeah.
And then, so were you then primarily teaching osteopathy and with a bit of developing your own yoga style on the side, or how did the next phase develop?
Well, I was an Iyengar teacher. I had an Iyengar, I'd qualified as an Iyengar teacher in, as I say, 86. I had a fairly reasonable reputation as an Iyengar teacher. And, obviously in those days, there wasn't so much traveling around, but I had quite a good, I had 4 or 5 classes in this area. And I was starting, and of course, one of the nice things about having well, kind of one of the nice things, one of the fortunate things about having a lot of yoga students who you teach when you're training to be an osteopath is you have a ready on towel. But I mean, they knew me very well, and if people had aches and pains, they would tip up. They would say, "Oh, do you want to, can I come and see you?" So my osteopathy class took off. Osteopathy work rather took off fairly well because I was fairly networked. What was more worrying was I started to notice that some of the people who were coming to see me seemed to be getting damaged by the yoga I was teaching. And that it took me a while for that to register. I don't think I wanted to register it for a while. And the usual take on that in those days was, if you hurt yourself in your class, it's because you're not doing it right. You haven't understood how to do the posture properly, and it was your fault. That was the de facto way of dealing with people's problems. Oh, you obviously haven't quite understood this pose. It was never the fault of the posture. But I was slowly starting to realize it probably was the fault of the posture, and my realization that I was quite likely hurting people was troubling, and so I slowly started to think about different ways of teaching, and with Mary's influence and my growing understanding of biomechanics, I started to look for more biomechanically friendly ways of teaching.
Where were you teaching? What were any of the places that you were teaching then still functioning now? I mean, or
well, I used to teach in adult education in Stemming, where I lived at the time, and then I moved to a place called Washington in West Sussex. You might know it. That's a tiny little village, but it's got quite a nice village hall, and I used to teach in the village hall there, and I had quite a generous class there from all the neighbouring villages. So it was real village yoga. I taught that class for probably 15 years. And I really loved that class. It was a very beautiful setting, under the foot of Chanktaburi Ring. And I loved that period. So I taught in Stenning, and then I started to teach at the Brighton Natural Health Centre. I got a class over there as well. So I had these kind of huge drive. I spent a lot of my time driving around. And then slowly I migrated towards Brighton, moved out Stenning towards Brighton, and my classes more around here.
Yeah, I think Brighton Natural Health Centre opened in 81, didn't it? I think, or
well, that sounds about right. Yeah, because I remember going to Jonathan Hindon's class, and at about that time, you think, yeah, it would have been about that time, yeah.
And I think the Brighton Buddhist Centre was doing yoga at that time as well. They were the first 2 organised places, I think, that were doing yoga. Around that time. Yeah,
that wasn't my territory.
No. no. And they were in a different location from where they are now as well. They were before they moved to Titchbourne Street. And so, okay, so when did you start thinking about having your own studio? Because I know you have the lovely Unit 4 studio just around the corner. When did that idea come to you to actually open your own studio?
Well, I never had any intentions of opening a studio. When I moved to Brighton, I met my wife Sabine, who's Swiss, and in, gosh, get these dates right, 1997, she moved to England. So, and we bought this house in Brighton where I'm sitting in now, in 5 Ways. One of those fortunate bits of serendipity at the bottom of a housing market crash. It's hard to believe now, but when I bought this house prices were going down. People were knocking thousands of pounds off their houses in the hopes of buy it before it got even cheaper. Extraordinary times, and just incredibly fortunate for me at the time because I could afford to buy a house. So she moved in here, and we were here for 3 years. And then in year 2000, my son was born, Dominic, and I was working from home in those days. So my clinic was in my spare room. But when you've got a baby in the house, it doesn't work.
No.
It doesn't kind of fit. And so we were looking around for a clinic for me, and that's the place where we've got Unit 4 came up for lease. And it was a pig in a poke, really, because in those days when I first took it over, the downstairs were 3 lock-up garages.
Yeah.
And there was 2 carpenters and a mechanic working down there, with radial arm saws and planers and thicknessers and lathes, and the mechanic, with his hydraulic jack and his noisy air pressure thing for undoing car wheels. Yeah,
it's just made a cameo appearance. So
it was extraordinarily noisy, and we just all I did was rent the upstairs premises, which was the big room and 2 smaller rooms, and I had a clinic in one of the smaller rooms, and I thought, well, I'll try teaching yoga in the big room. And we did, but it was, for me, it was a bit traumatic because, you start a class and then the mechanic downstairs would start bashing something with his hammer, or the guy would start planing bits of wood, and you hear these terrible noise coming up from downstairs. And I thought, it's just not going to work. But I don't know, we got through a summer or 2, and then one of the carpenters moved out, and I thought, well, I can't risk another carpenter moving in. Sorry, it's my cat. Yeah.
It's the highlight of the internet.
So it's like bashing me on the head in a minute because it's nearly supper time for her. So the one carpenter moved out, and I couldn't risk another carpenter moving in. So I took it over and just used it as a storeroom, which put the price up for me a bit, but made it a bit quieter. And then, really sadly, the other carpenter, a nice guy, he died. He got a brain tumor and died. So that one became vacant. So I took that one on. And because we own now 2 lockups, we converted one of them into a clinic room. So we have one clinic room, then one storage room, and then the garage. And then eventually the garage guy left. He'd had enough. His wife had become ill, and they decided to sell up and go abroad. So I took that on. So then I had the whole building. And ostensibly I started it there because I just wanted not to work at home, and then I ended up running a studio with 3 or 4 clinic rooms, and I still wish I hadn't, in a way. I've never been much good as a manager, and so I've made it a very autonomous place. People hire it and hand the keys over and just pay rent. They can do what they like, and I've always run it like that. I tried to keep it. Actually, over the years, of course, what happens is you develop a community of people, and which is very heartwarming. And over that, so we bought that place, or didn't buy it. We leased it in 2000. We've been there 21 years.
Yeah.
And now nearly everyone is teaching their teachers the kind of yoga that I'm interested in, and it's developed its own little ambience, which is great.
Mm.
It's
And it's
completely.
a lovely little place as well, actually, isn't it? So, I
Oh,
mean, as an
thanks.
outsider, I can confirm. I mean, it is a really nice place to be. So,
Thank you.
um, uh, so just going back though to your sort of collaborators in on the yoga field, uh,
Yeah.
before you open up the studio. I mean, I interviewed for another one of these interviews, Gary Carter, and
Mm,
he mentioned how influential you were on his development, and he's sort of
mm.
not dissimilar from you in a way, in that he's very interested in the body, and and now is
Sure.
involved in dissection and so
Yeah.
forth.
He's gone down the anatomy route. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. But tell me about those days when you and you knew Gary, and John Stirk, I think, was around in those days as
Mm.
well as a big influence
Well,
on people. Tell me about
yeah.
that group and who was involved, and,
Mm,
and what it was like to be involved in that group of really interesting people.
mm. Well, I met John. John was a lecturer at my osteopathic college. So how I knew him was through osteopathy, and he would talk about yoga sometimes, and then I would sort of collar him in the corridors and pin him down in various rooms and try to talk more about yoga, because he was quite enigmatic in the way, what John's like. Um, he's a good storyteller, and he was one of the better lecturers at college. He would always tell a good story. He was very engaging, and he had an understanding of the body, I think, that was unique. Whereas everybody else I was learning from at college was fairly mechanical, because osteopathy is in those days, was a fairly mechanical process. John was always less so. He was always much more into movement and feeling and sensation. Um, and he always had a bit of a twinkle in his eye. So I always liked talking to him. And he was him who introduced me to Mary Stewart, of course. So that's how I met John, and then I invited him down to Stenning, where I was living at the time, and asked him to do a workshop down there. So that's the first time I actually worked with him. I didn't actually study with John much, but I did. I used to go to the workshops I'd organise. And I organised several
Yeah.
for him, and a lot of what he was saying just made more sense to me. Because he was an osteopath, he'd got some osteopathic understanding. His understanding of mechanics was, and he was kind of braver or more. He dismissed the Iyengar stuff quite lightly, or I think he did. I don't know. I haven't ever talked to him about that, but he seemed to. From my perspective. So it gave me more confidence that you could break away from someone like Iyengar and still keep your integrity. Because I think there was a part of me that thought, well, if I'm, he's the guru. And in those days, he was the only real serious teacher around. Ashtanga hadn't really got its foothold in Brighton at those times. And so if you weren't doing his stuff, the only other thing around was a rather flaky organisation called the British Wheel of Yoga. In those, and I don't mean that disparagingly, in those days it was a bit eccentric and a bit sort of peculiar. And so, you felt a bit cast adrift. But Mary Stewart and John Stirk and Sophie Hoare, who was a friend of John's, also someone who had worked a lot with Vanda, developed some kind of other grouping that I felt happier in, because there wasn't a group in Brighton like that. So I was on my own to start with that kind of idea. And Gary, I met. Well, I think he must have just come to one of my classes.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
I guess he must have tipped up at one of my classes at Brighton Natural Health Centre. And we became good friends. In fact, when my wife moved over here, he and I drove to Switzerland in a van and got all our furniture, took all our furniture in a van and drove back from Switzerland to Brighton in a couple of days. That was quite an adventure. So, we messed around quite a lot. And he was into bodybuilding at the time, as you know. He started Natural Bodies. He was interested in non-drug bodybuilding, because a lot of the guys who are into bodybuilding were using testosterone anabolic steroids, and he was very against all that. So he was interested in how do you keep the body fit and healthy and looking good without that. And he and his then girlfriend, I think, were doing competitions and things. And yeah, he was very interesting. He got a very small gym in John Street in Brighton, which was really a garage. I think it had a few free weights in it, and I went down and he tried to show me how to lift weights, but I never quite got the hang of it. I was probably not a very good student, and so he was, he used to come to my classes. He and a few others, of course. At the same time, there was Liz Warrington, Neville Cregan, Lisa McRory, Faye Fitzgibbon, Ros Preston. These were a kind of group of people who all used to come to the same class. And we started, and then when Gary moved his studio to Jew Street, we used to practice there. We used to get together. I think I was nominally running it, but the kind of group of us would explore yoga and talk about things, and we'd all input stuff. And I guess because I had a lot of anatomy because of my osteopathy training, I took a kind of anatomical lead. I'm now slightly embarrassed by that because I think anatomy is not a good way to understand yoga, but I did think it was a good way of doing it then. And there were good times. We used to go to workshops. I remember we all drove up to Sandra Sabatini in London, and who was also kind of contemporary Mary Stuart's. And these kind of people, that kind of environment where John and Sophie, Sandra Sabatini, Diane Long were all kind of teaching. We were getting interested in it. Some people were more interested than others. Gary got very interested in Diane's work, I think. I never really resonated with her, so it didn't. I was too cerebral, I think, and Diane was too inarticulate for me, in her way. I don't mean that disrespectfully. She didn't talk much. She demonstrated, and I couldn't get it, as it were. But Gary did, and Liz found her very interesting. So I always find that an interesting process, how we select our teachers and that we get drawn towards people who fit our psychology or our way of being.
And I think
that's how we get.
I think these groups, I mean, you just mentioned sort of like a group of you almost like learning together and practicing together and bouncing off each other and so forth. I think that's, I know that occurred to some degree in the Ashtanga community in Brighton as well. At different times, there have been groups of people practicing together, and perhaps going off piste, as it were, in a way that they can't in the official classes and all the rest of it. And I think that that type of thing is a very Brighton type of thing, to have people actually learning like that in a group. And it's probably been quite a key part of the development of yoga in the city that those groups existed.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's difficult to know how long we did that, but 4 or 5 years probably, we were kind of working pretty regularly together, and that ferments a lot of ideas. You cross-fertilize ideas, you talk, you go out for coffees together, you think about stuff, and then, clearly Gary got very drawn into the anatomy. Lisa's gone down the Feldenkrais route. I'm not quite sure what Liz is doing these days, but I think she moved to Spain for a while. She had children over there. So then you kind of disperse these ideas, and I've been always more of a believer in the transmission of ideas by osmosis, kind of horizontally, rather than to set up schools and this is how you do yoga. I'm a bit suspicious of people who do that. I shouldn't be, but I am a bit suspicious of people who set themselves up as an authority to teach in a particular way. I'm much happier with the notion that if you have an idea, and I certainly have ideas about how yoga should be taught or is useful to be taught, and clearly we all teach from our own perspective, but I would never be I'm more happy if people take a bits of what I'm teaching, slot it into their way of teaching, rather than try and take my stuff wholesale and teach it as a method. That's seems to me less useful. Developing another method, I'm more worried about.
And so just going back to the studio, I mean, if you opened around 2000, that would have made you one of the oldest studios now in the city, actually, because I don't think there were that many more. I mean, there was Evolution Arts, there was, I think maybe Yoga
Yeah,
Haven was opening about the same sort of time. I'm
about
not
the
sure.
same time. Yeah, yeah,
Um,
and of course the Natural Health Centre.
yeah, of course,
The
yeah,
old
Brighton
centre.
Natural Centre, the Buddhist Centre, and Evolution Arts, and
Yeah,
um,
yeah. No, we've been there a long time, and what I like about it is it's very local. I mean, it's the people who come are the residents of Five Ways and Roundhill.
Round Hill, yeah. Mm,
It's a very community-based studio, and I always had an idea that what I'd love to do is stick a cafe on the end of it. If it had been my premises, I would have had a kind of rest room, but we could never quite afford to turn one of the rooms into a rest room, where people could just chill afterwards and hang out. That would be my ideal, to have a yoga studio where you could have a cafe or something, and people after the class could all go.
mm,
But I couldn't make that work, unfortunately, because the rent there is too expensive to just chop
mm,
one of the rooms out. And
yeah,
now it's really tough because of COVID. We're really struggling there.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you've seen the Unity Centre in Lewis. That has a little. It's not a restaurant as such, but it has sort of food and so on in the
Mm,
reception areas. In
mm,
this new place they've opened there, which is interesting. I think you're right. I
mm,
think it actually adds to the sense of community to have that facility, a broader sort of thing,
mm.
particularly if it's serving
Well,
nutritious food and so forth. Yeah.
sure. And because I always felt from the Iyengar days, the thing that really I missed was the conversation about the class afterwards.
Mm,
And I used to do quite a lot of retreats with people like Louise and Kathy, and we'd go on retreats together, Iyengar retreats. And what I loved most about it wasn't the yoga; it was the walks we'd go on, and the talks and the conversations we'd have, and our thoughts around the ideas and why were we doing this and what were we.
mm,
Again, that kind of fermenting of ideas through discussion,
mm,
which was so rich, for us back in, when Nev, Gary, Lisa, and myself, Liz, were all talking. So, and yoga often doesn't lend itself to that. You turn up with class, you do your class, and then you go. So it can be a bit on your mat. I've always been interested in trying to provoke some kind of conversation in classes, not necessarily about yoga philosophy, but just about life. I mean, I don't mean, it's got to be related. I think how we engage in life is very important.
mm.
Um, and to me, that's a significant part of yoga practice, how we think about it. And how you bring that into a class is easier if you've got somewhere to talk afterwards.
Mm.
Mm.
Although you said that you weren't interested in setting up schools of yoga and that,
Mm.
nevertheless you have got quite an influential set of people in the city who've trained with you, who've taught with you in
Mm.
in Unit 4 and so on. There is almost like a very loose grouping of teachers in the city who probably identify with you. Would you
Sure.
not say?
Yeah, but that's fine. I mean, if you think about the way any kind of teaching happens, if it's reasonably horizontal and not too vertical, you disseminate ideas. You've been thinking about it. You teach your ideas, and initially people will take them fairly close. But if I think about Gary now, or Neville, or Lisa, I think if you ask them, they say, yeah, I was an influence. But if you went to their classes, they'd be teaching quite differently to me,
Yeah.
and that's the way it should be.
Mm.
I'm happy to be a kind of ripple in pebble in a pond, rather than a statue in a marketplace. I'm not quite sure if that's a good analogy.
Amen to that. Yes.
Yeah.
Uh, And of course, you've written a book as well, and
Yeah,
you are associated with the idea of, I think you've described it, I think, as humanistic sort of yoga.
sure.
Do you want to
Mm.
say a little bit about that? Because that is a quite distinctive sort of approach that you've developed
Yeah,
and
okay.
associated with.
Yeah, now I probably have to backtrack a bit. Um, like all of us, I spent you train in yoga. I also did a British Wheel of Yoga teacher training course, and I also trained to be a DCT through them at one time, in about 2004. And I have a so you study all the philosophy, the texts, you read around the subject. I also have a very good friend, a man called Peter Connolly, who's a yoga philosopher. I used to have a lot of conversations with him. And one of the things that I started to feel when I was reading, it's going to be a bit controversial probably, but it's just the way it is, the way my mind works. When I was reading Patanjali or the Gita or some of the tantric texts or any of the sutras, I would, and people would sort of tell me what they meant, and I wasn't going to learn Sanskrit, so you kind of have to believe the interpretation and then you start realizing that different people interpret these things in different ways. And then you get a synthesis of all these ways and you think, well, I wonder, you know, and you start to realize that you pick the way that suits your own bias a bit more. And it started to feel a bit like Bible readings to me, that you can look at an old text and you choose the bits that you like and you pick them out and you leave the bits you don't like, and or you interpret it in a particular way that suits your own biases. And that kind of made me a bit unhappy. I thought, well, I don't know, we can be ever arguing about all this sort of stuff. And some people really like that. I mean, and I get that too. Some people, you get these old Jewish scholars studying the Talmud endlessly and coming up with new insights, or the Torah, and you never get to the end of it. So at some point, I thought, well, for me, yoga is an experiential practice. It's about what I feel, it's what I notice, and what it does for me, and how it helps me respond to the world. And I thought that there are Western equivalents to the language, about sensation, feeling, a response. And when Vanda was a little bit like that. So she would talk about gravity, the breath. She didn't talk about Patanjali or the Gita. What do you feel when you practice? What do you notice? What do you notice about yourself? And these became more and more interesting questions. So I started studying more psychology and philosophy in the Western field, as well as the kind of Hindu traditions, and seeing that there were clearly parallels. But when I'm talking to students, they don't have to interpret a Sanskrit language or understand it from a Hindu perspective to get it if I'm teaching from a kind of Western humanistic stance. These days, you could even, this was long before anyone was talking about appropriation and worrying about these kind of things. But, one of the things that struck me several years ago, well, probably 15 years ago, because my sister was still alive then, I remember having a conversation with her about growing up in our family. And we were discussing our childhood. And she was just a year older than me. So we grew up very close together and our childhood very sort of intertwined. And when we started talking about our mums, our dads, our histories, our what we remember, I thought, bloody hell, it's like we grew up in different households. It was her perspective was so different to mine. And we were kind of sitting there going, really? Really? Do you remember it like that? And I thought how hard it is to see the world through another person's eyes. And if I couldn't see the world through my sister's eyes, who grew up in the same family, only a year apart from me, what chance have I got of really understanding yoga, which is a different culture, 1,500 years ago, through the eyes of people in a very different time? I thought I've got bugger all chance of actually understanding really what they meant. I've got no idea. I'll be guessing. So I started to think about how I could situate yoga from a benign Western perspective, and humanism is about as benign as I can think, in the sense that it's about how do we get on with each other, how do we help each other flourish, um, how do we make the world a better place by paying attention to what we're doing in the world and how we treat each other. So there's lots of correlates there with sort of non-violence and truth. And perhaps the only thing that is different is the application of science and reason, which probably is missing from. Well, I've just recently read some old Hindu scriptures that were very kind of atheistic and scientific in their thinking. I realized that there was quite a strong strand of that I hadn't previously been aware of. But you can, and for me, then you're not. Well, I'm not appropriating anybody else's culture. I'm taking the experience of a practice, because I suspect, and I really do just imagine this, that all these practices started with someone doing something and noticing how it made them feel, and then starting to write it down and annotate it. The difficulty with that, of course, in the end, once you've annotated something and written it down, is people then start to try to conform to the experience that you've written down, and instead of lead you to your own experience. And I've become much more interested in what we experience as individuals when we practice. What is our experience of ourselves in relationship to the world when we practice? Not how can I conform my experience to a set of expectations. And, I know that there will be lots of yoga scholars out there who say, well, that's not what it says in yoga, but there's a lot of people that will inadvertently be doing that. That there are ideas about, I don't know, the yamas, the niyamas, that have been written down, and that we could decide what they mean and how we should progress through these levels of introspection or interiorization. Anyway, so I got to this sort of humanistic stance. But to me, yoga for me has been the pursuit of physiology, psychology, and philosophy. How do we work with those three things in a world to make the world a better place, and our place in it a better place? And I think that's a very yoga concept. And I don't think the language you use, whether it's kind of Western language or a more sort of ancient Hindu language, makes much difference.
I think that's a very good definition of yoga, and one with which I entirely agree. So yeah. And in fact, maybe this is a good place to stop at this point.
Sure.
And I mean, thank you, Peter. I mean, you've taught me in the past, and I found you always to be the most thoughtful yoga teacher I've actually taught with, even though I come at it from a different perspective from you, as you well know. But I've always found you the most thoughtful teacher. So thank you for that, and thank you for all the work that you've done in developing yoga in the city. I mean, I know you're not looking for any praise, but you're going to get it anyway. So thank you from me and from many other people for all that you've done.